The Pentium 4. Yep, we're going there again, but we rarely ever touch on how the series finally burned itself out, ending with a surprisingly competent form of the CPU. This right here is the Intel Pentium 4, but not just any Pentium 4, no, this is one of the final Pentium 4s. One last dying attempt to try and cling on to an already dying architecture. So what actually happened? What is the story behind these final CPUs? And did they have any redeeming factors? Well, we already know the basics, and I have some other videos on the topics covering the most common of the Pentium 4s, and even the Celeron story that goes along beside them. But for the world's quickest recap on the Pentium 4 series, and NetBurst in general, they had a fairly abysmal reputation. They were all hot, they were all slow, and with an exceptionally long pipeline they ended up stalling, which meant that when it came to cost-cutting them with the Celeron series, those ended up really doing not all too well at all. Those earned the name the Celeron Disaster, because they had the name Celeron D, and that went along well with the Pentium 4s, which were based on the Prescott architecture towards the end of their lifetime, and ended up being called Prescott, because they only ate through power, and they ran very hot because of this. But what's the story behind the last of them? See, it didn't all end at Prescott. This is where this weird CPU comes out. Well, to put it into perspective, we're entering the 2006 territory. You know, the Pentium D is out and floundering about against AMD's dual-core offerings, and it had been doing so for a while. And for some unknown reason, you'd think the market was covered. You know, you've got everything you need in every segment. You've got the Celerons at the low end, the Pentium D covering the mid-range up to the high end, and for some unknown reason, Intel wasn't content with just selling their Pentium 4s to cover whatever portion of the market they were actually selling in. They decided to die shrink them, and add a 1 onto the end of the name. So the Pentium 4 630 became the 631, the 640 became the 641, and so on and so forth. The thing is, unlike the Pentium Ds, which saw an architectural change when they shrunk them down to 65nm, the Pentium 4s didn't. Nothing changed. It was the same old Prescott CPUs, just now apparently they were less hot, which I suppose is something of a selling point. So what exactly is going on with the specs? Is there at least something going on that makes these compelling to buy? Maybe? This right here is the Intel Pentium 4 641. One of the most common variants of the processor out there today, so common in fact I managed to buy mine brand new in the box. So this is as close to an out-of-the-box review as you will ever likely see in 2020. It is very much a standard Pentium 4 640, but shrunk down from the aged 90nm process to the much newer and still very large 65nm Cedar Mill process. It is very much a good old Prescott CPU, but this time shrunk down and hopefully without the hot part of Prescott. Well, at least that was the thinking when they released it. Still maintaining the usual high clock speeds and a decent chunk of cache, it is very much what you would expect of a Pentium 4. The thing is, this being a new release, these things held a price of around £180 or near enough $200 US, which isn't cheap. So who was buying them for this price, and why were they even selling when you could get far better processors far cheaper? Two reasons actually: overclockers and businesses. I'll start on the far more boring side first of all, as businesses from a few accounts I found online were able to buy them up as sort of a stopgap upgrade. A lot of older machines they had running usually had OEM Intel boards and had support for these Pentium 4s because why wouldn't Intel support their own processors? It was an easy upgrade and you could easily throw some surplus cash away if you had some budget to waste. And from what I saw on the forums, that's where a lot of these got sold to. And that's also the reason why a lot of them didn't sell and I was able to get one brand new today. Really though, it did bring down power consumption if you were putting these in office PCs, and you could justify them as an upgrade because all boards supported them that might not be able to support things like, I don't know, a Pentium D945 or other things that sold for around the same price or even less. Really though, the other more exciting area they sold was overclocking. See, the 65nm node, as much as people praised it for its reduced power consumption, it meant that you had a lot of overclocking headroom. So much, in fact, that reviews online didn't really focus on this power consumption, they focused on how far you could overclock them. Same goes for old forum posts, blogs, and a lot of these chips did actually have a good degree of value in the overclocking scene, being able to match or surpass the older and still very expensive Extreme Edition Pentium 4s. But still, for most consumers, compared to AMD's options and even Intel's own Pentium D series, these CPUs were remarkably poor value. Not everyone wanted to overclock a netburst CPU, because even these were hot when overclocked. So before we touch on how they came to their demise, what exactly is the performance like? Well, we're going to be throwing this in a system that I managed to find that actually supported this CPU, along with 8GB of RAM and a HD 7770 to see exactly what you can expect from the Final Pentium 4. Right, so performance is pretty much the same as your bog standard Pentium 4 that we've seen all over YouTube and even a few times on this channel before. All this really has is boosted clocks, which does help slightly because, 3.2 versus 3.4 GHz, and I know this game looks absolutely awful here, at least in terms of graphical quality, but GTA 5 is being semi-playable on a Pentium 4. The stutters down to 1 FPS, or 0 FPS in a few instances, were not great. However, there wasn't all too much input latency, and maybe if you made the game look more like a PS1 title with a few more graphical tweaks, it could definitely be doable. Probably. CSGO really did show off that it's still getting worse, and worse, and worse, every time I end up benchmarking it on older hardware. As a few years ago, we were actually seeing, double digits on a Pentium 4. Now we get to see around 5 FPS on average, with lows down to 2 FPS, and this was regardless of resolution, with the lowest settings possible. Not that it really made much difference. It didn't get much better in single player modes with no players, hovering around 6 FPS if you decided to play in a completely empty map. This genuinely isn't great. Still, I beat a few people though, so the satisfaction of beating someone on a Pentium 4 is still there. Older titles like Fable The Lost Chapters ran perfectly, and other than a few minor frame drops during intensive areas which did bring down the average slightly, this was running perfectly fine in higher resolutions. And with higher settings, loading was quick, and all in all, it can't match a Core 2 Duo or anything like that, but for retro gaming it does still work nicely. Then again, this game also ran on a Pentium 3. The same also goes with newer indie titles like The Organ Trail, which ran at whatever your refresh rate was set at. This was with the default settings and seemed to be running perfectly fine, with the endless game mode and even large crowds of zombies. It didn't matter what you were doing with this game, it was simply no issue for a Pentium 4 to handle, so those simple new indie titles will run absolutely fine. Terraria did struggle a little bit, but if you throw on the lowest settings then things did seem to run pretty smooth. I'd imagine that this is down to the shadow effects being quite intensive until you turn them all down. All the while this is the case though, the game is probably going to stay smooth right up until the late game. But I don't think the Pentium 4 of all things will be handling that all too well, as I'm pretty sure anyone that's actually played the game knows just how hectic it can actually get. Still, with lower settings, right up until that, you will have a relatively stable experience. Gary's mod with the lowest of the low settings was capable of keeping a very playable frame rate. You can turn off a lot of details and shadows with the extras menu, which does claw back just a few extra frames, which can really hurt the Pentium 4 if you leave them enabled. Heavy physics effects can definitely cause some slowdown, but most things work absolutely fine. I was able to build a fridge with wheels that never seemed to stop moving, and that worked perfectly on a Pentium 4. Now we all know Warband works, but Vikings Conquest, the DLC, can be pretty intensive. However, once again, the Pentium 4 did manage to push its way through the game, although bigger battles were definitely a struggle, and load times were a complete mess. I have no idea why the Pentium 4 does not like loading. In fact, I do know why, it's because of the massive pipeline with the architecture. But either way, we're not going to focus on that. This is about the core gameplay, which was actually intact and fully playable, even with the biggest of DLC installed. So there you go, this does work on a Pentium 4. So across gaming it did alright. I wouldn't say it did spectacularly, as even for one of the Final Pentium 4s, performance is still right in line with what you would expect with a Pentium 4. It's definitely admirable, considering that ultimately they weren't too fantastic at it when they came out and were still relevant, and these are far from relevant today. The thing is, how well are they holding up in day-to-day usage? Well, as we discovered earlier, the main reason people were so eager to upgrade to these CPUs was actually for general usage and office tasks. So why don't we get right onto that? I was using Windows 7 for most of my testing, along with 8GB of RAM and a semi-recent HD 770 GPU, as really that's pretty overkill for what you'd be doing on this little processor. Now the GPU does allow for some better hardware acceleration in certain areas, as you would expect, but still, across general tasks, whether or not you were using the graphics card or not, everything from web browsing to word processing was still doable. It was sluggish in a few instances, and heavy websites would cause it to chug and pipeline stall briefly, but even then it was doable. Compared to even the lowest end of Core 2 Duos from this era though, it's a major downgrade. The sheer cost of these CPUs though means that the performance we're seeing is passable. It's just the price of these things was so high that even CPUs from when this were released would have been better value and would have performed better not only today, but even back then. Still, even as much as I want to complain about the poor value of these CPUs, they are compatible with a lot of older OEM boards and use far less power than a standard Pentium 4. The stock cooler provided actually relatively overkill performance to keep these things cool and running not toasty, keeping the CPU at a peak of around 62 degrees C under full load. Admittedly, the idle temperatures were a little bit higher than I would have liked, but anyone in the UK knows what the weather has been like right now, and I'd put this down to being more than understandable when you consider just how hot it is inside. But once again, this is nowhere near as good as the other offerings from the era. It's virtually just a Pentium 4 that tries its hardest to not have all the heat issues of a Pentium 4, or the power drain issues of a Pentium 4. Which it does well, it's just a Pentium 4 that's not hot and doesn't eat through as much power. But at that stage, you really are just polishing a turd. So there we have it, the Pentium 4 series, ending not with a bang, but with a very quiet whimper. Performance is exactly what you would expect, and I did have to go searching for a motherboard to test this with, as the main boards supporting it were either quite old high-end boards for overclocking that had great CPU support, or really basic OEM boards where Intel provided the support, because of course they'd support their own boards. The thing is, my old XP Dell didn't even have support for these. They went straight to supporting the Pentium D and even a few Core 2 Duos, but none of these Cedar Mills CPUs at all. The thing is though, at the time, a low-end Core 2 Duo would have destroyed this in performance, and a Pentium D, although harder to justify, was cheaper and did have a second core, which does aid the longevity, especially today. But really though, NetBurst as an architecture is a mess that I keep on covering. And no matter how you cut it, the Pentium 4, even in its final days, was still just a Pentium 4. And that isn't exactly something you want to be hearing. I am really fond of these little chips. God knows that's probably the reason I keep covering these things like the Pentium D and the Celeron disaster and now this mess. But there you have it. The final Pentium 4. They finally had the high clocks, they ran a bit cooler, they could actually overclock themselves to what Intel probably would have really liked to have sold them at. It just was never enough to be decent, and was too little, far too late. Thank you very much for watching. Good night. So, I had to make this video with a broken camera, so half of it was filmed on my phone, which is fun. And if you want to see more like this, you can like and subscribe. Videos should start going up more frequently as soon as I can sort out the camera situation. But yeah, thanks very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you soon.